All right. And it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Leah Cairns. She is a program officer in the Board of Health Sciences Policy at the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. Her primary interests include health policy and biomedical research. And prior to joining the National Academies, she served as a AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellow, working as legislative staff for a member of Congress, focusing on health policy and appropriations. She also previously served as a Christine Mirzayan Science and Technology Policy Fellow at the National Academies in the Policy and Global Affairs Division. She received her PhD in biophysics from Johns Hopkins and a BA in biochemistry and molecular biology from Hamilton College. So welcome, Leah, and feel free to take it from here.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me. And it's really nice to be here with all of you today, and nice to see a few friendly faces from my time at Hopkins and now working in policy. And I'm totally going to call out my co-conspirator from my days at Hopkins Science Policy Group, and my current coworker, Chanel Matney, is here. She helped found Science Policy Group and is also a program officer with me at the Academy. So Chanel, I hope you speak up if I say anything wrong and feel free to chime in and help me out. So I will share my screen. I hope I get the settings right. And let me just flip those. Okay. All right, are you seeing
there we go.
Slides without
Yes.
notes? Okay, great.
Yeah.
All right, so I'm just going to walk you guys through briefly kind of my work in science policy. First, kind of just sharing how I got to my current position, and then we're going to dive a little bit more deeply into the work I do at the academies to give you a little bit of a sense of, you know, what it is like to do science policy, at least in my role. So briefly, I was a student in BCMV, and I loved it. I started in 2013 and I graduated in 2018. And I was a member of the Cabrin Lab over in the School of Public Health. So shout out to Jennifer's lab, loved it. If anyone's still looking for a lab, check her out. So after I graduated on October 28th. That date might be familiar for some of you because it was just in time to apply for some of these policy fellowships where you unfortunately have to have your PhD in hand to apply. But anyway, so I served as a Mirzayan Fellow at the National Academies immediately after graduation. And then I started a Congressional Fellowship on the Hill. And I did see actually that there were some questions about that. So I'll spend a little bit of time on that before I get into my current role. So I applied through the Biophysical Society. You can apply to this fellowship program and work in the executive branch or work on the Hill. And I worked on the Hill. I worked for Representative Derek Kilmer, who is a Democrat from Washington State, and I was his health policy staffer. One of the things I loved about my role is I just got thrown into the deep end, and I advised the member of Congress on all things health policy. And actually, I also covered agriculture because that's kind of how it works in House offices. You just kind of get thrown in head first, which was really fun. And I learned a lot about health policy, a lot about healthcare policy. And after that year finished, I realized I missed working, more closely related on topics to biomedical research. So that's where I saw this listing at the National Academies with the Board on Health Sciences Policy. So I started here as a program officer immediately after my AAAS fellowship. So what are the National Academies? I fully admit I was not super familiar with the work before I applied to the Mirzayan, and so it was a real hands-on learning experience. So the National Academies are one of the most prestigious academic honorific societies, and they're actually founded by Abraham Lincoln at the height of the Civil War. So he needed a body of scientists to help advise on issues that were important to the nation. And one of the first examples is that the government asked a group of scientists to figure out how we need a compass that will work on an iron-hulled ship. So that's that was kind of the genesis of this is there's a group of experts that the government can call on to help advise on all things science. And since then, we've had a really long history of advising the government and other other groups on all things science. So I have a couple of examples just to give you a little bit more of a taste of some of our work. This one I actually just found out my boss worked on, which is really cool. This is a report on the airliner cabin environment from 1986. And this report was very controversial at the time for recommending that the FAA ban smoking on flights, which is really funny that it's like totally normal. And it's crazy to think that people used to smoke on airplanes, even though, we've seen it in Mad Men and all that. But this was a recommendation from the National Academies that was controversial at the time and really made a big impact. Another one that is near and dear to my heart, because I worked with this committee with this group during my Merzine Fellowship, is a report called Strengthening Forensic Science in the United States. And again, this report is, I think about 20 years old and maybe only 10, but this was also controversial at the time because it basically said that forensic science is not science. A lot of what had been taken as scientific evidence in courts and in the field of forensic science was not really based on scientific principles. And this is still one that people are fighting today to improve how the courts and how our justice system uses science in its proceedings. This is another big one that has had an impact in academic spheres, this sexual harassment of women, climate, culture, and consequences in academic sciences, engineering, and medicine. This was really a landmark study in identifying how prevalent of a problem sexual harassment of women is in science. And some kind of exciting new activities have come out to try and change the culture in academia as a result of this really, really amazing report. This is another one that is near and dear to my heart because I worked on it as a fellow. When I was completing my fellowship, I worked with a committee who was like brainstorming this idea. And it was a really funky one about emerging field of human neural organoids, transplants, and chimeras. So, when do we have to start getting concerned about a clump of neurons in a dish? If we start implanting it into animals, all of a sudden we could get into some pretty funky sci-fi level concerns. So this was a fun one that I got to see from the very beginning and was published, I think, just last year. And finally, my most recent favorite is this was my first report for the National Academies as a full-time staffer. It's called Space Radiation and Astronaut Health. NASA actually came to us, and they're trying to deal with the issue of when you send astronauts out into space, they get exposed to a lot of radiation. And we can manage it now with astronauts going to the space station, but in the future, when NASA wants to send astronauts to the moon for longer periods or to Mars, which is really far out and a lot of radiation, NASA has to deal with a lot of complicated risk management protocols. So this was a really, really interesting study that recently came out. And what you might notice is, well, of course, this set is definitely skewed towards biology because that's what I enjoy thinking about. But the National Academies of obviously science, engineering, medicine work on a really, really broad array of topics, across science and technology, all kinds of fields. And what I really love about the job and about our work is how a lot of these are really interdisciplinary. So for the space report, for example, of course, we had to learn about, well, I learned a lot about space radiation and biostatistics of calculating risk, but we also had ethicists on the committee, and that's true for a lot of these, is you need a really interdisciplinary and engaged committee to help you write these reports. So that kind of takes me to giving you guys a little bit more background about what goes into making these reports, because it's all good to say, we have this really cool published book at the end, but what is it actually like to create one of these? And this is what my job is like day to day. And this is where a lot of the communication skills come into play. So I'm going to walk you guys through a quick overview of the whole process, and then we'll dig into some more of these stages as we go through. So the first step is to define your study. And we write something called a statement of task. And this is a pretty detailed document lining out some of the questions. What are the big policy questions? What are the big scientific questions that someone wants us to answer? And that also gets into who sponsors these reports because they cost a lot of money. As I said at the beginning, the government typically is the sponsor. I think maybe like 70% of our work is sponsored by the federal government. And the other 30% often comes from nonprofits who are interested. And we do get some funding from for-profit companies, but in a very specific category. Something I didn't mention at the beginning is that the National Academies has this very long history. Obviously, we've been around since the Civil War, but we have a very long history that we work very, very hard to uphold of being an unbiased, impartial, arbiter of science. And that has really served us well over the years because a lot of our processes, which is a lot of bureaucracy on the part of staff, making sure that our work is unbiased and neutral, is really important to upholding our institution and the trust in our institution that the government and the public place in us. And so that we do our best to stay away from, being called biased or being called partisan and wading into politics, even though we delve into policy and it can affect politics. So when we're defining the study, we work with our sponsors and it's sort of a negotiation process to figure out what are the most important questions. And then we pull together a committee of experts, usually somewhere between 10 and 20 experts in any range of given fields will come together. They meet over the course of a year or two, and just to do the work of writing this report. So that involves committee meetings, information gathering from other experts, other stakeholders who are not on the committee directly. They deliberate about policy recommendations, and of course they draft the report with a lot of staff support. Our reports are peer reviewed, and then they get released to the public. And throughout the study process, we definitely take into consideration our communication strategy. So we want to involve stakeholders at the very beginning as we're defining the study, throughout the information gathering process, through review, and then of course, when we are disseminating our findings of our reports. And one interesting thing that is sort of changing at the academies is in an effort to really uphold that image and the position of neutrality, although the academies puts out policy recommendations, they don't do advocacy. So we definitely aren't lobbyists. We aren't, we aren't, sorry, I just lost my train of thought. We don't lobby. We don't typically go out and do a lot of advocacy to carry out our recommendations, and we encourage folks to do so. But something exciting that is now changing at the academies is there are some new avenues to publicize and disseminate the works of the academies. And one of those, for example, is called an action collaborative, and this is where academies can support the work of outside experts to take up recommended actions of a report. A prime example is an action collaborative on sexual harassment that was based on that report I told you guys about. Okay, so let's get into a little more detail so you can see what some of these stages are actually like. And I'm going to be bringing in examples from a project that I'm currently working on, which I'm really excited about. So the committee is called the Committee on Use of Race, Ethnicity, and Ancestry as Population Descriptors in Genomics Research. And this is a study that came to us from NIH. It is a topic that they have been interested in for a long time, and a lot of scholars have been working on this. And the charge is really for us to put together a committee to review and assess existing methodologies, benefits and challenges in the use of race and ethnicity and other population descriptors in genomics research. So I'm not going to read all of these, but I wanted to give you a sense of what a statement of task for a study is like. So this is actually just an abbreviated version of the statement of task, and the statement of task kind of acts as a contract between our study committee and the sponsor. So these are a list of bullet points, and it actually goes on even further. And as I said, this is the abridged version of what some of these, what are some of the questions that the sponsor wants us to look at. So as a science communication as a writing exercise, this is a really important stage in the process, because this will help the committee decide, what they need to cover, who they need to talk to, and it will be what our reviewers compare the report to. Yeah. So the next stage of the committee process is committee selection. And this is one of my favorite parts, because we get to talk to all kinds of experts in the field to just figure out what the topic is like, and who we should be talking to, and who might make a good committee member. So actually, I'm going to pause my spiel here, take a glass of water, and ask you guys to chime in. And maybe you can respond in the chat, or just feel free to raise your hand or pipe up, and maybe the folks from Hopkins can help me call on people. But I was hoping you guys could help me brainstorm. What are some of the areas of expertise that we might need for this committee? And I'll bump back 2 slides so you guys can at least see the beginning of the charge again. But does anyone want to propose any ideas? Who are some of the folks we might want to talk to carry out this statement of task? Let me see, I've got one in the chat. Nope, not in the chat. Geneticists, yes, thanks, Beth. Yep, number 1 is we definitely want geneticists and people working in this area. Yep, Norman, anthropologists, population biologists, ethicists. This is great. Chris, GSA, Genetic Society. These are really good ideas. So I really like, Norman, you mentioned anthropologists, and that's something really important to us, that this study is interdisciplinary. So although we will have a lot of geneticists on the committee, there's also going to be a lot of different types of social scientists. Yep, Chanel, health disparities, epidemiologists. Good, these are good. Yeah, Vern, that's a good idea. Tribal governments and tribal IRBs, that's a really interesting group when we're talking with issues of genetic data management is going to be a really interesting. Sociologists, community representatives. Good, I like this. Okay, those are all really good. And let's see, I have a list of a few that we came up with as we were putting together this committee. So different types of geneticists: population genetics, clinical genetics, genetic epidemiology, statistical, computational, functional genetics and genomics. So history, anthropology, sociology, demography, population statistics, so folks who work on the census, and then ethical, legal, social implications research. Yes, so thank you all for your ideas. These were great, and I think they lined up pretty well with our list. And actually, this committee was just publicly announced yesterday, so I can drop in the chat later. But we just announced who's going to be on the committee, covering, I think all these ideas and a lot of crossover in between. Okay, so now that we have formed our committee, we are getting ready to have our committee meetings and gather information. So in addition to some of that expertise, who do you guys think are some of the audiences of this report? Who do you think we are trying to reach? Who might be someone who's reading this report? Any ideas? Appropriators, yep. Funders. Institutions, yep. Researchers. Pharma companies, insurance. Researchers, genetic counselors, yep. Yep, staffers of elected officials. Yeah, these are good. So I'll pull up my cheat sheet, and this was not comprehensive because I hope many more types of people. But of course, one of our most important audiences is our sponsor. They are the ones paying us to do the report. And although we're not trying to be biased in any way of like writing the report for them. We have to be responsive to what they've asked us to do. It's a contract after all. And we know that they are going to be the ones kind of to use it. So, but of course, researchers themselves are folks we hope take up the recommendations of this report, clinicians, patient groups, journals, journal editors, research funders, but really also all that good overlap with some of the groups you guys identified as expertise we need on the committee. So these are some of the groups that, as we are putting together our public workshops, so all those information gathering sessions, as we're writing the report, and as we are planning our communication strategy for after the report is released, these are some of the groups that we keep in mind throughout the process of, you know, are they, is our report going to reach the right audience? So after the report is written and the committee has drafted its recommendations, the report does go through peer review, as I mentioned. Oops, sorry, down the side. But some of the, it's funny, it is very similar to like academic research peer review in some ways and different in other ways. So what our reviewers are asked to look at can include, top line is, does the report address everything in the statement of task? Does it go too far? Are the conclusions and recommendations backed in evidence and backed in science? Is data treated appropriately? Are policy issues handled appropriately, sensitively, that kind of thing? And then, of course, the report is released and communicated. And as I mentioned, historically, the National Academies has taken a very almost defensive approach of not wanting to appear biased or like they're out there advocating for certain policies. So traditionally, once the report is public, it is out of our hands. And we do maybe brief the sponsor and brief some interest groups, but we don't do a lot of, we don't do any advocacy trying to implement the findings the recommendations of the report. But as I mentioned, that's kind of changing, and folks are, you know, in our leadership, and people are seeing a little bit more of an appetite that scientists can and maybe should take a bit more of an active role in making science a part of the process, in policy making and politics occasionally. Again, not to say that we're wading into politics or we are trying to be biased, but the academies are just thinking generally about how to get the science more deeply into the policymaking process. Okay, so I've been talking about recommendations, and these findings, conclusions, and recommendations really are the heart and soul of our reports. Of course, there's lots of great text on the background information and the evidence leading up to these, but if you're flipping through one of our reports, people flip right to the findings, conclusions, and recommendations. They're kind of the exciting part. So what are they? A finding is a statement of evidence. And they're kind of self-explanatory, but an example here is tamoxifen and raloxifene have been shown to substantially reduce risk of ER-positive breast cancer in women who have not been diagnosed with the disease. And it goes on a little bit. So a finding, again, as it says, is a statement of evidence. It's a fact. A conclusion, and this is kind of the first opportunity where the committee can put some of its own analysis onto these findings. A conclusion is an inference, interpretation, or generalization drawn from the evidence, and it should be supported by the findings. So an example that follows that first finding is, additional research is needed to identify other drugs that can reduce risk of all forms of breast cancer with minimal risk of other adverse health effects. So again, this is one step beyond that finding. You know, the finding is the statement of fact, and here the committee is concluding something about that finding. And finally, a recommendation is a specific action directed to a specific actor related to policy, practice, or subsequent research that is supported by the evidence. A recommendation should be supported by committee findings and conclusions. So the example here is, breast cancer researchers and research funders should pursue continued research into new breast cancer chemoprevention agents that have minimal risk for other health adverse effects. This work should include efforts to identify chemoprotective approaches for hormone receptor negative, ER negative breast cancer. So they're kind of a mouthful, but we do try and keep them as short and punchy and to the point. And sometimes our recommendations will be followed by some bullet points or other supporting text that can elaborate on these. But I think these are really nice examples of the progression of what a finding, conclusion, and recommendation are. So again, from the writing standpoint, because I know this is a more of a communication writing workshop, I find these really helpful. And another little hint into what my job is like, I love working with the scientists who are experts in their field, but a lot of them are academics, and they're not as good at being concise and to the point and thinking about the policy in the way that I am. And so my job is often to take what they're saying and help them get it into a really useful policy recommendation. So here are some guidelines that we give to our committee members, and of course we try and follow as we're writing recommendations. So number one, use the active voice to specify an actor and an action. And this is always really important in any policy making, is you have to be really specific about who and what you want to get done. Recommend actions that can be evaluated, because if you just throw something out into the ether and it can't really be measured, then what really was your impact, and how do you know if it's being done? Recommend a single way to accomplish the goal if the evidence supports it, or if the evidence supports multiple ways, recommend a set of acceptable means and provide the pros and cons of each. So again, this really has to be backed in the evidence and be as decisive as possible. Less is more. As I mentioned, we like short, punchy recommendations. That can be a big fight with academics sometimes. But you know, I love a neat and tidy recommendation. And you might have noticed in the previous recommendation, should is used a lot. Should is always more appropriate than shall or must, because we have to remember that no one is required to do what the National Academy says, and often they don't. And that's the way policy works. Even if the science supports something, you know, even if science supports something, the policy and the politics still have to work. So we use should, because that is a recommendation, not a mandate. And the last one is avoid the obvious. And that's just, maybe that in itself is obvious, but if someone could come up with your recommendation without even reading the report, then it's not really worthwhile. And we do try and make our recommendations impactful and purposeful and evidence-based. So yeah, so we have some more technical style guide type guidelines, but these are the ones that I think really apply to lots of policy making. Okay, so this is my last slide, I think, and I want your guys' help fixing this recommendation. I have to say, because it's my job and because we have to not reveal anything going on with the study committee. Our study committee on population descriptors has not met. This is not a real recommendation. Nothing I say should be taken as the committee's work. This is just something I came up with when I was putting my slides together. No one read into this, but I want your help. Here's a recommendation that our committee could come up with. They might decide genetic ancestry is a better population descriptor than race. So how would you guys turn this, which is not a very good recommendation, into a real recommendation according to the Academy's guidelines? So I'm gonna pull them back up, but the recommendation is genetic ancestry is a better population descriptor than race. Okay. Here are the guidelines again. Yes, Tina, specify an actor and an action. Instead of actually just calling out these guidelines, can you guys try and rewrite it? So who is a better actor and action? And feel free to use your mic. You don't just have to, I know it's easier to type in chat and that's okay too, but if you want to chime in, there's not too many of us. Researchers should report genetic ancestry instead of race. That's good. So we have researchers in there, we have a should. Yep. Yeah, Kate, I like how you included genomics research. You know, you're getting a little bit more detailed into how this is going to be used. But one more fix to that one is we recommend, and I would flip that around to make it active voice. Just like Sarah did, researchers should do this. Which types of researchers? I guess I definitely follow the less is more rule, but I think actually in this case, we would need a little more detail because at this point you could say, what is genetic ancestry? That was super vague. And in what circumstances? There might be, sometimes you use one population descriptor, sometimes you use another. Yeah. Awesome. All right, so this was a pretty simple example, and I would encourage you guys to go to nap.edu to read more of our reports and see some of the other examples of policy recommendations. I can almost guarantee that if there's like a policy topic that you're interested in, we've probably done a report or held a workshop on it. And so it's a really great place to look at our reports, and specifically the executive summaries. And sometimes we have really good one-pagers with just the recommendations. There are really good examples in there of just the ways that we turn science into policy at the National Academies. So that is, I think, the end of my slides, but I wanted to leave a lot of time for questions because I know we got a ton of questions ahead of time. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and maybe you guys can raise your hands, ask your questions out loud, or of course you can put them in the chat if you prefer.
I think so. I think we had a couple in the chat just before this exercise.
Okay, before the exercise, do you want? Should I scroll up? Do you mind reading them to me, or someone?
Sure, unless there's one from Bianca. If you want to ask it yourself, you're welcome to.
I can do. I'll hold on, scroll up to where it was. Right. So my question was, who makes the decision about what contracts to accept? Like you mentioned, since the research is responsible to the sponsor's request, but you want to be mindful of how that bias can skew the report, especially in, historical things like the cigarette on planes and stuff like that.
Yeah, that's really important. And I should have mentioned, I probably breezed over it. Sometimes reports come from a staff idea, or a committee gets together and says, hey, this would be a good idea for a report. And then we go out and seek funding for it. And sometimes, like the ones that I've been working on recently, a sponsor has a question and comes to us. So we definitely have a lot of internal bureaucracy for a good reason, especially deciding what these statement of task say and what types of questions we answer. So at the first level, it's project staff, someone like me or someone who's done this for longer, and our board directors, people like my boss, are the ones first vetting, like, is this in the realm of something we would consider? Is it really a question that needs answering by science? And then once you start developing that, we really, really go through those documents, the statement of task, which is a back and forth between us and the sponsor initially. We go through those with a really fine-tooth comb to make sure that none of those questions are accidentally biasing the outcome of the study. So it's a back and forth. And then once, we decide to move forward with it at the board level, so like at the staff level, we get it approved by our division, and then more and more and more, and it goes all the way up. There's actually a governing board of the National Academies that is made up of elected members of the National Academies, so people from that honorific society arm of our large organization volunteer to review these proposals and make sure, again, that they're unbiased, that that they're an appropriate task for us to take on.
All right, we have some people that raise their hands. So Alice, if you want to ask your question.
Yeah, thank you for your talk. My question was, once a report is written, what steps, if any, do the academies take to kind of advertise that report or get it into the hands of people that may be interested in it, aside from just the sponsor?
Mm-hmm. Yep. So yeah, like I said, primarily we hand it to the sponsor, but we do kind of a variety of different dissemination efforts. And as I said, this is something a little bit newer to us, and we are starting to work into our budgets. But sometimes sponsors don't want to pay for it, but they are now recognizing more and more that this is important and the findings should be released broadly. So it's important to mention all of our reports are freely available for download on our website. We do release briefings that are open to the public most of the time. I think that's pretty much standard at this point. And then from there, it can kind of escalate. So depending on if there's funding available or interest, we might go out. And I say we, and it's study staff supported, but it is still primarily carried out by the study committee. They can go out and give briefings to scientific societies. We will sometimes write up, maybe not like opinion pieces, but commentaries for journals, to submit and help advertise. We do social media. We try and do some of the more innovative, and we'll see if they stick around. People are trying to do more. I really like there's some like interactive web pages that are more like toolkits that we're trying to get out into the hands of researchers or whatever stakeholders are out there. People are trying to do podcasts now, which is kind of makes me laugh because like there's so many podcasts in the world. But if it's another way to reach people, it's a good thing. So although we don't do any advocacy, as I've said, I think probably 10 times now, we do try and, spread the word of what our findings were and recommendations, or as much as possible.
That's really interesting. Thank you.
Amanda, if you want to ask your question.
Yeah, thanks. Great talk, Leah. Thank you. My question you sort of answered with Bianca's question, but when it comes to like the study definition, in your slides, you had that list of like 10 different questions.
Mhm.
Are those questions that like your sponsor provides to you, or do they kind of give you one thing and you guys came up with that? And then do you run from there? Do you pare it down from there? Or is it just, it's, based on what's proposed to you, and then you obviously like mold it around that? I don't know if
Yeah.
that's too many questions, but.
No. I think it's good. They're all kind of rolled up into one. And the real answer is it actually depends, and it's different every time. So it can be both. So I'll give you an example from some of my work. So the NASA project, that was actually a really technical review of NASA's risk management protocols. And they came to us saying, please put together a committee to review this very specific thing. And so that one was mostly them telling us what they wanted us to review, because it was a really narrow part of their risk management protocols that we were evaluating. This one, my genetics study, I think was a little bit more back and forth. I actually wasn't on the project at that stage, but I think often it's both. We write something that falls into, or maybe the sponsor writes something of what they're interested in. We turn it into something that fits our templates and our style and our what our statement of task usually looks like. And then it can actually be a back and forth negotiation to get that exact wording down. On the total opposite end of like my NASA experience, for example, when I was a fellow, I worked with the Committee on Science, Technology, and Law. Really fun. They do really cool work. It's probably shouldn't say the coolest because I work for a different board now, but they do really cool work. But they more often will come up with a topic. So they've got this really cool interdisciplinary committee of scientists and like lawyers and judges and ethicists. They get together twice a year and like brainstorm. And that's how that neural organoid topic came up. One of the ethicists was talking to his friend who was a biologist, and they were like, whoa, this research is accelerating really quickly. And there's some really gnarly like ethical issues that we're gonna want to deal with. And maybe it would be good to deal with them or have a committee weigh in on them before the science is really scary. So that is a case where the academies drafted a proposal and then shopped it around to a bunch of different sponsors. And I think that there was a variety. NIH funded that partially, but also some private philanthropies funded that one.
Awesome. Thank you. That's really good to know.
Oh, and I see Chanel chimed in the chat, and that was a good thing that I didn't mention. Yes, Congress is a big audience, and sometimes Congress commissions reports directly from us. And yeah, we do definitely offer congressional briefings to any of the committees or offices on the Hill who might be interested.
So I think we had one question about the recommendation example and elaborating on the difficulty in, I think the difficulty in accessing ancestry versus more proximal race descriptors. And I think this sort of speaks to the point about balancing less is better than more versus covering all your bases and being sort of impartial. So I wonder if you could speak a bit more about that.
Yeah, that's a good one. And it really does get at some of the difficulties that we're going to have in writing recommendations for this report. And something I like that's in our statement of task actually is that the committee has been asked to look at how to actually go about implementing some of the recommendations and looking at feasibility. And what I really like is they've asked the committee to look back at historical data sets and how do we reconcile historical data sets that have been cataloged and collected in a certain way, but maybe we still want to use that data, but it just doesn't fit some of these future systems that we want to propose. So it is really about that like balance of how difficult is this to do versus what is the science support. So when we need to get into some of those details, that's of course where the supporting text comes into play. And sometimes you have to elaborate on why you don't recommend something. And you can use the space in the report to discuss some of these more nuanced questions. And as I said, the example recommendation I gave was like really short, like 2 or 3 sentences, but pretty often our recommendations have this top line message followed by a bunch of bullets that kind of elaborate on what, how to actually go about implementing it, or what are some of these nuances in different situations that that you might need to take into consideration.
Thank you. Okay, we have another question in the chat about your day-to-day work schedule.
Yeah, well, it's all remote now, so I do a lot of email and Zoom. But I would say it's a mix. So I mean, it changes throughout the course of a study cycle. So I would say in like November and December, I was having a ton of 30-minute meetings with experts in the field because I was deciding who to put on the committee. And that was really fun. That's one of my favorite parts of the study process because it's really crazy busy and everyone starts blending in together, but it's like this great crash course in whatever topic I'm about to spend a year working on. And the other really cool thing about working at the academies is people love working on these studies. They're volunteers and we ask a lot of work of them, but people really love it and people enjoy the process, and there's a lot of prestige that comes with working with the academies. So it's really fun. I get to email very, important people and they answer my emails and want to chat. So it's a really fun way I get to meet some really cool experts in tons of different fields. So that was what my day-to-day was like for those couple months. Right now, I'm doing meeting planning. So it's both, unfortunately, like logistical, like how am I gonna spend these 8 hours with the committee and get all these steps done that we need to do, but I'm developing materials for them. So examples of things we do. So obviously meeting agendas. We have to decide what external speakers to bring. We start drafting, like I have drafted a very light, maybe report outline just to show the committee, like what does this report start to look like? So that's kind of the stuff going into it now. Later will be lots of writing. There is a lot of writing in my job. Staff do rely on the committee members to write, but they don't always do their assignments. So we do a good amount of the writing, the editing, and Chanel, what else do we do? You know, meetings with colleagues, you know, learning about all the processes at the academies. Yeah, go ahead. Do you have anything to add?
We do communications and dissemination as well.
Yeah.
So thinking about what the core message of the report is, getting it into a nice punchy soundbite, and then making tweets, you know, LinkedIn posts, however, to sort of get it out to the right communities. Building out the website, you know, having ways that a user can come to the website and sort of easily get to the gist of the report. But a lot of it really is the coordination and the administration, which is not to be taken lightly. A lot of what we do is sort of managing the brilliance, right? You have a committee of like however many like really, really smart, engaged, passionate people, but you have a limited amount of time to get them to focus their energy and attention on a particular question. Well, first you have to decide how you're going to define the question. So a lot of our job is sort of keeping them on track. You know, here are the parameters, here's your charge. They might veer off to the side and you kind of have to bring them back. They might talk for a long time and they haven't really made a decision. So you have to say, okay, what I'm hearing you report is X, and I'm going to write this down. Is this what you want to say? If not, correct me. So, you know, you're taking their genius and you're pulling it down into like actionable recommendations, you know, conclusions that we can publish so that they come out with their report that they feel reflects, you know, their consensus. And so that's a bit of an art, you know, and a science, sort of herding all of those sheep in a way, but it's really fun. And everyone we work with is like just a really delightful people. I feel like the academies, at least my team, makes an effort to avoid working with people that have a reputation for being mean. That don't play well with others, because again, it's a consensus. And so I feel they do a good job of like protecting the reports and protecting staff from just negative personalities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's not just like oh, it's annoying to work with people who aren't team players. That can derail our committees. And something I feel like I maybe didn't say enough times is these are consensus committees. They're consensus reports. All the committee members have to sign off on the text on every single recommendation. There is technically a process for dissent, but we do our very, very best. That's very rare. We avoid that because the goal here is consensus. And sometimes that means walking a recommendation back. If some committee members want to propose something really radical, but you can't get everyone on board, then, you know, it's not supported and you have to pull something back that maybe is less impactful, but you can get consensus on it. So consensus really is key, and being a team player is huge. And yeah, as Chanel said, that's a lot of our job, is managing that balance and those personalities, but it's really fun.
I see some questions in the chat about how to find out about report releases or upcoming activities or workshops. In a minute, I'll put a chat in the link to where you can subscribe to various boards or forums or roundtables of interest. So there's ones on nutrition, cancer, mental health, neuroscience, genetics, whatever. And so there you can get updates about upcoming virtual events for now, and certainly report releases. So there's a question in the chat about the different types of report releases, and I mentioned the ones that are sort of closed for congressional staff. However, there are others that are open, you know, public release, public announcements, and those are free and open to the public. And then sometimes we may also have a closed session briefing for the sponsor. These presentations, of course, are going to look a little bit different because they're different audiences. And what you might say to the public about your 400-page report is different than what you might say to the sponsor, who has very specific questions in mind. So I'll put some of those links in the chat for how you can stay informed.
Yeah, and I see, before Amanda, we get to your question, I see another in the chat. How dramatically do you have to buffer your reports to achieve feasibility? And that really depends on the topic, because it can totally vary. And I think the goal of every committee is to make something really impactful and forward thinking, but it does always have to be grounded in science. And I think that helps, really helps us. And it's not to say that we would say, oh, that's too hard, it's not feasible, like it's not worth trying. Sometimes we do set those goals, But in the policy setting, it is really, really important to make sure that it's something that the actor can actually get done. Because if you just set something that's not realistic, like if I say NIH should triple their budget and pour all of their resources into this one area, that's never going to happen. So realism is important in lots of areas of science policy, and especially often on like the politics side. You have to acknowledge that certain things just aren't going to be taken up. But it is at least really fun at the academies that we really lean on the science to drive us, to steer us. Amanda, do you want to ask your question? Maybe, oh, there you are.
Yeah, hi, sorry. My Wi-Fi is being a little weird right now, so hopefully you can hear me. I guess kind of in relation to what you guys have just been talking about, walking back some of those recommendations or whatever, if you need to do that. Are you commonly kind of placed with a task by your sponsor, like, can you tell me, X, is this dangerous? Is it safe? Or is it more like with your NASA thing where it was like, just evaluate the safety in general, and then do you feel like you are commonly having to alter like your end goal of recommendation, or is it just, I guess, kind of still their answers like it's always, a migrating type of and like movable process?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I am going to totally answer the question you're asking, but I think as far as scope and like what scope the recommendations fall into, it can really vary. And that often is dependent on what the sponsor wants. Like the example you mentioned, the NASA one was really narrow, and there were a bunch of other cool questions and like ethics questions that the committee wanted to get into, but it was beyond what NASA had tasked us with. And we definitely, like our report won't pass review if it goes beyond the statement of task. And that can be disappointing. Sometimes it leads to new projects. One of the rules I didn't mention for our recommendations is we are highly encouraged. We would never recommend more academies reports because that just looks unethical. We can't say, even though it feels cool, and actually committees ask us, like they want to say like, wow, you really got to put together a committee to do this. But we don't put that in the recommendation because that appears biased. We're not just going to like recommend that the government fund us, like give us more work. So we definitely have to keep the scope in check, and that affects recommendations, but that's where really good like project management and preparation as you're developing the task is good. Because the better you can define the appropriate boundaries early, the more satisfying or successful your report will be later. And I should have mentioned, when we're in that negotiation process, or if the staff are just drafting up a proposal, we do talk to experts in the field. We have a lot of people on our standing committees kind of on standby to like help us put those together. Sometimes the ideas come from them. So we're not totally just like guessing as a non-expert in these fields. When we put these together, we really do our best to define it appropriately at the beginning.
Awesome. No, that pretty much got it.
Okay, good. Victoria has a question. Do you bias reviews of the committee members to make sure you don't only have one perspective? Yes. So I don't know what do you mean about like biased reviews of the committee members, or maybe just views? So something, that I didn't get into is that we have a very thorough bias and conflict of interest process as we're putting together our study committees. So we try and avoid all conflict of interest, whether real or perceived. So for the most part, if there's any conflict, someone's not going to be chosen for our committee. And then bias is a good one, because we know it's not like we're asking everyone to come in unbiased. We are asking them to come to the table with opinions. And we know everyone has a bias. So something we do at our very first committee meeting is this bias and conflict of interest discussion. So everyone goes around and introduces themselves, talks about their approach, their feeling, their thoughts on the statement of task. And one of our jobs as staff, actually before that, when we're putting together the committee, is to make sure that those biases are appropriately balanced. Of course, we don't want anyone so far balanced on either side that they can't come to the table with an open mind. But we know people come with different perspectives, and that's exactly what we want. And we wouldn't be doing our job if we didn't have those different perspectives. If we just got a committee of people who already agree, then that's a really boring report. So yeah, that bias and conflict of interest discussion is really helpful for us to figure out if we have the right people at the table.
And to add to that, we think a lot about the composition of the committee in general. And there's so many dimensions. One is bias and conflict of interest. One also, of course, is diversity along many dimensions. Of course, gender, race, ethnicity, geographic location, institutional diversity, career stage diversity, diversity of opinion. And so this is one of my favorite parts, actually, of the report process, is sort of putting together like your varsity lineup, like selecting people for your football team. And you want to select them so carefully because you're going to be working intimately with their minds for the next however many months. And I think something the Academy, given sort of the increased national awareness around diversity and representation, has been giving staff more and more tools to make sure that we are plugged into experts from historically underrepresented groups, that we have good gender balance on our committees and in our workshops. And so it's something that we pay a lot of attention to.
All right.
We're at the time.
Yeah, we're right at 1 p.m. So we can, pause the recording, but thank you so much, Leah, for the presentation and the great discussion that we had. Also, Chanel, for coming in and also giving your perspective working at the National Academies. As a reminder, we will be sending this recording and the slides as well. So if you have to leave, or we can always you can always rewatch this if you want to, or if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us. We're happy to help in any way that we can. So I think that's all we have for now. Just stay tuned for the third workshop that we'll have on data visualization. So thank you all again.